On the day of the wedding, tensions boil over when my mother-in-law finds out about my pregnancy before marriage. During the reception, my mother-in-law stands up in front of everyone, slaps me across the face, and shouts, "You beggar! I cannot accept you in my family." This public humiliation shocks the guests, but what devastates me even more is that my husband does not stand up for me. He remains silent and refuses to defend me, leaving me utterly alone in the moment. My father-in-law also remains passive, offering no support. But nobody knows what happens the next day. A storm is brewing. My name is Emily, and I want to share my story with you. It's a story filled with ups and downs, heartbreak and hope, and ultimately, the journey to finding my strength. I grew up in an orphanage, a place that was both a shelter and a reminder of what I lacked. The caregivers were kind, but they couldn't fill the void left by my absent parents. I learned early on that life would be a fight, but I also learned how to survive. I kept my head down and focused on my studies, dreaming of becoming an accountant and one day making my own way in the world. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I had worked hard and finally landed a decent job as an accountant in Chicago. I thought I was on my way to achieving my dreams when I met David Brooks. He was charming, from a wealthy family, and unlike anyone I had ever known. Our romance was fast and passionate. I was swept off my feet, and for a while, it felt like I had finally found my place in the world. Everything changed when I discovered I was pregnant. The news sent me into a whirlwind of emotions: fear, joy, uncertainty. I remember the day I told David. We were sitting in my small apartment, and I could barely find the words. My heart raced as I said, "David, I need to talk to you about something important. I'm pregnant." His reaction was not what I had hoped for. David's face turned pale, and he began pacing the room. "How can this happen? I don't even know how to be a father," he exclaimed, his voice filled with panic. "David, we can figure this out together," I reassured him, trying to remain calm despite the fear creeping in. "We can plan a future." But deep down, I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. David finally calmed down and promised to stand by me, even talking about marriage. However, that was before his mother, Caroline, entered the picture. Caroline Brooks was a force to be reckoned with, an influential businesswoman in her early 60s. She controlled everything in her family's life, including David's. When she found out about my pregnancy, all hell broke loose. She was furious, and I could see the disdain in her eyes as she confronted David about me. "Are you serious about this girl? She's nothing but a beggar. You can't marry her," Caroline shouted, her voice dripping with contempt. Despite David's protests, Caroline made it clear that she would not accept me into their family. I felt like I was being crushed under the weight of her judgment, but David promised to marry me anyway, hoping to shield me from her wrath. The day of the wedding finally arrived. I had imagined it so differently, a day filled with love and joy, but instead, it felt like I was walking into a battlefield. The ceremony went smoothly, but the real drama unfolded at the reception. As we celebrated with friends and family, Caroline stood up, her voice cutting through the laughter and music like a knife. "Emily," she shouted, pointing a finger at me. "You beggar. I cannot accept you in my family." Before I could even process what was happening, she slapped me across the face. I stood there, stunned, as gasps filled the room. The laughter stopped. Guests stared, and I felt all the eyes on me, judging, criticizing. But what hurt the most was David's silence. He didn't defend me. He just stood there, frozen like a statue. I thought I would crumble at that moment, but instead, I felt something ignite within me. I wouldn't let her win. I had spent too long fighting for my place in this world, and I wasn't going to let Caroline take that away from me. After the wedding, I moved into the Brooks Grand Estate, but I soon realized that the fairy tale was over. The reality was suffocating. David was distant, consumed by the pressures of fatherhood and his mother's expectations. Caroline's cruelty became relentless. She belittled me at every opportunity and even questioned the paternity of my child. "Maybe you've been lying about this baby," she would say, her voice sharp and cutting. "David deserves better than this." You're lucky he's even marrying you. With each passing day, I felt more isolated and unloved. David's silence became a heavy burden on my heart, and I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. Was I strong enough to face this alone? My heart ached as I watched David retreat further into his own world. He began drinking more, and I could sense the shift in our relationship. The love that once felt so strong now seemed like a distant memory. I often found myself wondering how I had ended up here, lost in a life that was supposed to be a dream. The turning point came when I gave birth to my son, Ethan. I remember holding him for the first time, feeling a wave of love wash over me. He was my reason to fight, but as much as I tried to be strong, the loneliness felt unbearable. That's when Mark and his sister, Megan, entered my life. Mark was a man in his early 40s with a limp from an accident, but his heart was big. He and Megan, a kind nurse's aide, became my lifeline in those difficult days. They offered me not just help but hope, reminding me that I wasn't alone in this journey. One day, as I was struggling to feed Ethan, Mark came over and said, "Emily, you're doing a great job. You have more strength than you realize." I looked up at him, tears in my eyes. "I just don't know how to do this without David's support. I feel lost." "You're not lost," Megan added, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You have us. We're here for you." In that moment, I realized that I could build my own family, one filled with love and support, despite the betrayals I had faced. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one that would test my resilience and change everything I thought I knew about love and family. But challenges were still ahead. Caroline's grip on David tightened, and my new family would soon face an uphill battle against her machinations. I just hoped I had the strength to stand firm and protect my son. Life in the Brooks mansion was far from what I had imagined. Each day felt like walking on eggshells, and I quickly learned that David was not the partner I needed. He spent more time away from home, finding solace in the bars and clubs of Chicago rather than in the warmth of our new family. I often heard him come in late at night, the smell of alcohol clinging to him like a bad memory. One evening, after a long day of caring for Ethan, I heard David stumble into the house. I was feeding our baby, and the rhythmic sound of the spoon clinking against the bowl felt like my only source of comfort. David entered the room, his eyes glazed over, and I forced a smile, hoping to connect with him. "David, how was your day?" He barely glanced at me. "Fine," he muttered, swaying slightly as he leaned against the wall. I felt my heart sink. The man I had fallen in love with was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. Days turned into weeks, and the tension between us grew. Caroline continued her campaign of emotional warfare, finding new ways to belittle me and undermine my role as a mother. "Ethan deserves better than a mother who can barely keep a job," she would say with a smirk, her eyes glinting with malice. I tried to rise above her taunts, but it was exhausting. I felt like I was constantly fighting a battle with no end in sight. One day, as I was struggling to calm a fussy Ethan, I overheard Caroline talking to David in the living room. "He's just a baby, Caroline. He doesn't understand anything." David's voice was strained, filled with frustration. "Oh, he will understand," Caroline replied, her tone icy. "He'll understand that his mother is nothing but a burden. If you don't get rid of her now, you'll regret it later." I stood frozen at the door, my heart racing. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Did David truly see me as a burden? I felt the walls closing in, the weight of despair crashing down on me. I couldn't let them win. I had to protect my son. That evening, I mustered the courage to confront David. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. He looked up from the couch, surprise flickering in his eyes. "About what?" "About us, about Ethan." "I can't keep pretending everything is okay when it's not," I replied, feeling my heart pound in my chest. David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emily, I'm just trying to figure everything out. I didn't expect this. Fatherhood, marriage, all of it. I didn't either," I snapped, frustration spilling over. "But we're in this together. I need you to be here for me for Ethan." I can't do this alone. He fell silent, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, he finally said, his voice low. No, you don't understand the pressure I'm under, I shouted, tears stinging my eyes. I'm trying to raise our son, while dealing with your mother's constant attacks. I need you to choose me, David. Instead of the support I desperately needed, he turned away, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. Just give me some time, Emily. I'll sort it out. With that, he retreated to his usual spot on the couch, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. Days went by, and my emotional state began to deteriorate. I felt trapped in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but lacking love and support. Mark and Megan were my lifeline. They visited often, bringing laughter and warmth to my home. One afternoon, as we sat in the living room, Mark noticed my distress. Emily, you seem off lately. Is everything okay? He asked, concern etched on his face. I sighed, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on me. I don't know, Mark. I feel like I'm losing David. He's never home, and when he is, he's not really here. Megan reached out, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. You're doing an amazing job with Ethan. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You're stronger than you think. Their kindness lifted my spirits, but it was clear that the battle wasn't over. Caroline's influence was suffocating, and I could feel her tightening her grip around David. I needed a plan to protect my son and myself from the impending storm. One night, after a particularly hard day, I sat alone in the nursery, rocking Ethan in my arms. The silence enveloped us, but I knew deep down that I had to fight for our future. With Mark and Megan by my side, I began to consider what my next steps would be. I couldn't let Caroline dictate my life any longer. Little did I know, darker days lay ahead. Caroline's desperation would soon lead to a scheme that would change everything. The stakes were rising, and I had to prepare myself for the battle of my life. I took a deep breath, holding my son tightly, determined to face whatever came next. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere in the Brooks mansion grew increasingly tense. I could feel Caroline's presence looming over us like a dark cloud, her disdain for me festering into something more dangerous. David remained distant, consumed by his internal struggles and the growing influence of his mother. It felt as though I was trapped in a nightmare, desperately seeking a way out while fighting to protect my son. One evening, as I was putting Ethan to bed, I heard raised voices coming from the living room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crept closer to eavesdrop. I could hear David and Caroline arguing. You need to put your foot down, David. Caroline insisted, her voice sharp. Emily is a distraction. She's not good for you, or the family. I don't want to hear it, Mom. David snapped back. She's my wife, and she's the mother of my child. You need to accept that. His words gave me a flicker of hope, but I knew better than to let it blind me. Caroline's reaction was predictable. You're making a mistake. She's nothing but a gold digger, and she'll take everything from you. You need to choose your family over her. I felt a chill run down my spine. The stakes were getting higher, and I could sense that Caroline was plotting something sinister. I made my way back to the nursery, holding Ethan tightly, and whispered a promise to him. I will protect you no matter what. The following week, things took a turn for the worse. Caroline, fueled by desperation, devised a plan that would shake the very foundation of our lives. I received a call from Mark one morning, his voice laced with concern. Emily, you need to be careful. I just heard something about Caroline's plan. She's looking for a way to take Ethan away from you. I felt my heart drop. What do you mean? Rumor has it she's been talking to lawyers. She wants to claim that you're unfit as a mother and that David should have custody of Ethan, Mark explained, his voice urgent. Unfit? I'm doing everything I can for him, I replied, panic rising in my chest. I can't let her take him away from me. He's my entire world. I know, but we need to come up with a plan, Mark said, his tone serious. You need to document everything, your parenting, the support you have from Megan and me. We'll fight this together. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, poring over paperwork and notes. I had never felt so vulnerable in my life, but I was determined to protect my son. Each moment I spent preparing was a reminder of the love I felt for Ethan and the lengths I would go to keep him safe. Days turned into a blur of meetings with Mark and Megan, gathering evidence and support. I even reached out to a lawyer who specialized in family law, determined to ensure that I had a fighting chance. But as I fought to secure my future, the tension between David and Caroline escalated. One afternoon, I overheard another argument between them. "You can't let her manipulate you like this, David," Caroline shouted. "You need to think of your reputation." "Reputation? What about my family?" David's voice cracked. "Emily and Ethan are my family now. Can't you see that?" I felt a flicker of hope once again, but it quickly dimmed when I saw Caroline storm out of the room, her face a mask of rage. It was clear that her determination to separate us was unwavering. One fateful night, as I sat in the living room with Ethan asleep in my arms, there was a loud knock on the door. My heart raced as I opened it to find Caroline standing there, her expression dark and menacing. "We need to talk," she said, her voice cold as ice. "About what?" I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know what you're doing, Emily. You're trying to turn my son against me," she accused, stepping inside without invitation. "You think you can just take him away from me?" I held Ethan closer, instinctively protecting him. "David is my husband, and Ethan is my son. I'm not trying to take anyone away from you." "Save your lies," Caroline hissed. "I will do whatever it takes to keep my family intact, even if it means getting rid of you." I stared at her, shock and fear mingling in my chest. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, I would," she replied, a sinister smile creeping across her lips. "This isn't over, Emily. Not by a long shot." As she left, I felt a sense of dread settle over me. I was in a war, and the stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. My heart raced as I thought about how far Caroline might go to keep control over David and the family name. I turned to Mark and Megan for support, determined to stay strong for Ethan. I knew I needed to prepare for the fight of my life. In the shadows of despair, I found a flicker of resilience, and I was ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. The storm was brewing, and I had to be prepared to weather it. The days that followed Caroline's threatening visit felt like a ticking clock, each second echoing my growing fear for Ethan's future. With every confrontation, I knew she was inching closer to executing her plan, and I had to stay one step ahead. I poured my heart and soul into preparing for what was to come, buoyed by the unwavering support of Mark and Megan. One afternoon, as I was reviewing notes from my lawyer, I received a text from Mark. "We need to meet. I have news." My heart raced. I quickly arranged to meet him at our usual spot, a quiet cafe where we could talk without interruptions. "Emily, I found out that Caroline has been spreading lies about you," Mark said, concern etched on his face. "She's telling people you're unstable and unfit to care for Ethan." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. "She can't do that. I've done everything to be a good mother." Mark nodded. "I know, but we need to document everything. I suggest you start keeping a detailed journal of your daily activities with Ethan, showing how much you love and care for him. Every little detail counts." With renewed determination, I began to keep a record of each moment I spent with Ethan, his first steps, the way he giggled when I played peek-boo, and the quiet moments when he fell asleep in my arms. Each entry became a testament to my love and commitment as a mother. As I continued to gather evidence, Caroline's attacks grew more aggressive. One afternoon, I received a call from my lawyer informing me that Caroline had filed for temporary custody of Ethan, claiming I was unfit due to my unstable living conditions and lack of family support. My heart sank. It was a blatant lie, and I had to fight back. The day of the court hearing arrived, and my anxiety was palpable. I could feel the tension in the air as I entered the courtroom, my hands trembling. Mark and Megan sat in the back, offering silent support, and I took a deep breath to steady myself. Caroline sat across from me, a smug smile plastered on her face. David was there too, but he looked conflicted, glancing between his mother and me. "Your Honor," Caroline began, her voice dripping with feigned concern, "Emily is unfit to raise my grandchild." She doesn't have a stable home, and she lacks any real family support. I stood up, determined to defend myself. Your Honor, I may not come from a wealthy background, but I am a devoted mother. I work hard, and I have a strong support system. Mark and Megan are like family to me. I will do everything to provide for Ethan. The judge listened attentively, and I felt a flicker of hope. I have documentation of my parenting, and I have witnesses who can testify to my character. I continued, gesturing toward Mark and Megan. Caroline scoffed, but I pressed on, sharing my journey as a mother and the love I felt for Ethan. I could see the judge's expression soften as I spoke, and for the first time, I believed that I might have a chance. After what felt like an eternity, the judge announced his decision. I am granting full custody of Ethan to Emily. It is clear she has demonstrated her dedication as a mother. I felt a surge of relief wash over me, tears welling in my eyes. I had done it. I turned to see Mark and Megan beaming with pride. But Caroline was not done fighting. "This isn't over, Emily," she hissed as I walked past her. "Maybe not," I replied, my voice steady. "But I will always fight for my son." As I left the courtroom, the weight on my shoulders lifted. I felt empowered, ready to start anew with Ethan. With Mark and Megan by my side, I knew we could build a loving family. In the following months, life began to take on a new rhythm. I found joy in the little things: Ethan's laughter, his milestones, and the love that blossomed among us. I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. Though Caroline and David would always be part of my past, I had learned the power of resilience and the importance of chosen family. My journey had transformed me, and I was finally ready to embrace the future with open arms. Together, we built a home filled with love, laughter, and endless possibilities. As I held Ethan close, I realized that I was not just a survivor. I was a warrior, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly free.
The first time I laid eyes on Michael was at a college seminar. We were both there for extra credits, though our paths were quite different. He was a business major, while I was pursuing literature. I was drawn to him from the moment he raised his hand and posed a challenging question to the professor. After class, we found ourselves at the same coffee shop, and from there, it just seemed like the universe wanted us to be together. We chatted about everything from college hobbies to our childhood memories. "I come from a pretty strict background," he mentioned, taking a sip from his cup. "My parents are deeply religious." I remember shrugging. "So my parents are freethinkers. They always taught me to question everything," I replied. "Sounds like we're from different planets," he laughed. But despite our differences, there was an undeniable chemistry. We began to see each other more frequently, studying together and exploring the city during the weekends. About 2 years into our relationship, we decided to move in together. It was a practical decision. Our apartments were far from the university, and sharing a place made sense. Plus, we were inseparable by then. However, when Michael broke the news to his parents, it wasn't received well. At a dinner at their house, Mrs. Davis, Michael's mother, was the first to voice her concerns. "Living together before marriage, Michael, you know how we feel about that," she said. "Mom, times have changed. It's not a big deal," Michael replied. "In our house, it is. You're living in sin," Mr. Davis chimed in. The evening ended on a somber note, but Michael and I were firm in our decision. We found a cozy apartment close to campus and moved in. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and our bond grew stronger. But the strain with his parents was always in the background, like an old radio playing a sad tune. One evening, as we were settling into our new life, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Davis, holding a pie. "I thought I'd come by and see how you two are doing," she said, looking around with a critical eye. "We're doing great, Mrs. Davis," I replied, trying to be cordial. She sat down, placing the pie on the table. "This is all temporary, right? You'll get married soon," she said. Michael cleared his throat. "We haven't decided that yet, Mom." As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the constant pressure from Michael's parents started to weigh on us. Our once carefree dates and movie nights began to have a shadow, the looming expectation of marriage. One evening, while we were making dinner together in our tiny kitchen, Michael broached the subject. "Lizzie, have you ever thought about, having a wedding?" he asked. I looked up from chopping the vegetables, surprised. "Like for us? Are you proposing?" He smiled awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Not exactly. I mean, yes, I want to marry you someday, but right now it's more about my parents. Maybe if we had a ceremony, they'd back off." "So you're saying a wedding without the legal paperwork?" I asked. He nodded. "Just a thought. We can invite friends, make it a fun day. My parents get their wedding, and we get some peace." It wasn't the romantic proposal I'd imagined, but I understood his reasoning. "All right," I said slowly. "But on one condition, we do it our way. No big church wedding, just something small and intimate." Michael grinned, relief evident on his face. "Deal." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparations. We chose a beautiful outdoor venue, invited our close friends and family, and planned a simple but heartfelt ceremony. When we broke the news to his parents, their reaction was surprisingly subdued. "An outdoor wedding?" Mrs. Davis asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, it's unconventional, but if it means you two are taking the next step, I suppose we can support it." Mr. Davis added, "As long as you're committed to each other, that's what matters." The day of the wedding was sunny and bright. I wore a simple white dress, and Michael looked dashing in his suit. Our friends cheered, and even Michael's parents seemed genuinely happy. During the reception, Mrs. Davis pulled me aside. "Lizzie, I want to apologize," she began, her voice soft. "I know we've been hard on you two, but seeing you together today..." I realized that love is what truly matters. I smiled, touched by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Davis. That means a lot." The day ended on a high note, with everyone dancing and celebrating our love. It felt like we had finally won Michael's parents over, and I hoped this would be a fresh start for us. But as days passed, their daily visits began. They'd drop by unannounced, often with unsolicited advice or thinly veiled criticisms. It was as if the wedding had given them a free pass to interfere in our lives. One evening, as Michael and I were unwinding after a long day, there was a knock at the door. Opening it, I found Mrs. Davis holding a casserole dish. "Just thought I'd drop off some dinner," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thanks," I replied, taking the dish. "But you know you don't have to do this." She waved a hand dismissively. "It's no trouble. I just thought since you're always so busy, you might not have time to cook." I forced a smile, sensing the underlying judgment. "We manage, but thanks anyway." As the door closed, I sighed deeply. Michael wrapped an arm around me. "It'll be okay?" he whispered. It started with subtle comments, the not-so-innocent questions. "Why is the house so messy?" Or, "Have you considered cooking something more nutritious?" Mrs. Davis would ask, her tone dripping with faux concern. One day, I came home from work exhausted to find her in our living room, reorganizing our bookshelves. "Mrs. Davis, what are you doing?" I asked, taken aback. She looked up as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Just thought I'd help tidy up a bit. These shelves looked so cluttered." Michael entered from the kitchen, holding 2 cups of tea. "Mom's just helping out, Lizzie." he said, trying to play mediator. I took a deep breath, my patience waning. This is our home, Michael. We didn't ask for help. Mrs. Davis pursed her lips, her eyes watering. I'm just trying to be helpful after all. Now, we're family. Days like these became more frequent. They'd pop by without notice, giving advice we never asked for, criticizing decisions we'd made together as a couple. It was clear they no longer saw boundaries. One evening, after a particularly trying visit from his parents, Mikkel and I sat down for a heart-to-heart. Mikkel, this has to stop, I began, my voice trembling with frustration. I can't live like this, feeling like I'm constantly being judged in my own home. He ran his fingers through his hair, looking equally stressed. I know, Lizzie. It's just, they're my parents. I don't know how to tell them to back off without hurting their feelings. But what about our feelings? Our peace of mind? We can't keep sacrificing that for them. A week later, we invited them over for dinner, deciding to address the issue head-on. The evening started off pleasantly enough. We chatted about work, friends, and the latest news. But as the main course was served, I took a deep breath and dove in. Mrs. Davies, Mr. Davies, we invited you over because there's something we need to discuss, I began, trying to keep my voice steady. Mr. Davis looked up, his fork pausing mid-air. What's the matter? It's about the frequent visits and, well, the constant input on our lives, I continued. Mrs. Davis looked taken aback. We're just trying to help. Michael took over. Mom, Dad, we appreciate that you care, but it's becoming overwhelming. We need some space to live our lives, make our mistakes, and grow together. Tears formed in Mrs. Davis's eyes. After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us? Mr. Davis added, his voice stern. We're just looking out for you. It seems Lizzie here doesn't appreciate family, Mrs. Davis said. Her tone hurt. I felt a pang of guilt, but stood my ground. It's not about appreciation. It's about respect. Respect in our boundaries and our choices. The room grew silent, the tension palpable. Mrs. Davis dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her shoulders shaking. We just wanted to be part of your lives. I never thought it had come to this. Michael looked torn, his loyalty divided, but he held firm. Mom, we love you, but this is our life. We need you to understand that. The evening ended with Mrs. Davis in tears, Mr. Davis looking disappointed, and an unspoken agreement that things had to change. As they left, I felt a mix of relief and dread, wondering what the future held for our relationships. Days after the confrontation, the house felt unusually quiet. The constant visits had stopped, but the silence was both a relief and a curse. Every time the doorbell rang or there was a knock, my heart would race, expecting it to be Michael's parents, but it never was. One evening, as Michael and I sat on our couch, he broached the topic. Lizzie, do you think we were too harsh? I mean, they're my parents. Maybe we overreacted. I took his hand, feeling its warmth. Michael, it's not about being harsh. It's about setting boundaries. We did what we had to do. He sighed deeply. I know. It's just hard. I never imagined being in this situation with them. As days turned into weeks, we began to feel the weight of our decision. There were no more surprise visits, but there were also no calls or messages. It was as if we had cut ties completely. During this period, I often found solace in browsing property listings online. One day, as I was scrolling through, a beautiful house in a neighboring town caught my eye. It had a large garden, a spacious living area, and most importantly, It was far away from our current life. "Michael, come look at this," I called out. He joined me, peering at the screen. "Wow, it's beautiful. But why are you looking at houses?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I was thinking maybe it's time for a fresh start. Somewhere new where we can create our own memories, away from all this drama." He looked surprised. "You mean move? Leave everything behind?" I nodded. "It's drastic, I know. But maybe it's what we need." We discussed it at length, weighing the pros and cons. The idea of starting anew was enticing, but also terrifying. Yet the more we talked, the more it felt right. A few weeks later, we visited the house. It was even more beautiful in person, and the neighborhood seemed perfect. After much consideration, I decided to use the money I had inherited from my grandmother to buy it. The day we signed the papers, I felt a mix of emotions: excitement for the new beginning, but also sadness for what we were leaving behind. The move went smoothly, and soon we were settling into our new home. It felt like a dream. The peace and quiet were just what we needed. One evening, as we were enjoying a quiet dinner in our new dining room, Michael said, "Lizzie, I think this was the best decision we ever made." I smiled, feeling content. I think so too. The first few months in our new home were like a dream. The mornings were quiet, filled with the chirping of birds, and the evenings brought a calm, tranquil energy. Michael and I fell into a comfortable routine, enjoying the privacy and peace that our new surroundings provided. The past seemed like a distant memory, and the attention that once surrounded our lives had all but disappeared until one fateful day. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Michael went to answer it. I heard murmurs and then a familiar voice. My heart sank. It was Mrs. Davis. I walked to the entrance, my face revealing my shock. There they were, Mrs. and Mr. Davis, suitcases in tow, standing at our doorstep. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his voice filled with surprise. Mrs. Davis smiled a bit too sweetly. "We missed you, dear, and we thought, why not pay a visit?" I tried to keep my composure. "It's unexpected," Mr. Davis chimed in. "We just wanted to see where our son is living now. Is that so wrong?" Michael seemed torn. "Of course not, but a heads up would have been nice." Mrs. Davis looked around, her eyes scanning our home. "Oh, what a lovely place you have here. Much nicer than the old one." I bristled but said nothing. The visit turned into a stay. One night became 2, then 3. They began to settle in, making themselves comfortable, much like they had in our previous home. One evening, after dinner, I pulled Michael aside. "Michael, we can't go down this road again. We moved to escape this." He sighed. "I know, Lizzie, but they're my parents. I can't just throw them out." "Then what? Let them take over our lives again?" Mrs. Davis, who seemed to have overheard our conversation, walked over, her eyes welling up with tears. "Is that how you feel, Michael? That we're a burden?" Michael looked helplessly at me, then back at his mother. "Mom, it's not like that. We just wish you had told us you were coming." She sniffled. "We just wanted to be close to our son, but it seems we're not welcome here either." I had a sinking feeling when I heard Michael's parents mention they'd made a decision about their living situation. The two of us had recently been discussing the matter privately, hoping to find a delicate way to address the issue. Now it seemed the matter was going to be thrust into the open. "Lizzie, Michael," Mr. Davis began, "we have some news." Michael shifted in his seat, already sensing what was coming. "Go on," he prompted. Mrs. Davis, trying to sound cheerful, said, "We've sold our house. We realize there's no need for it when we have such a lovely family home here with you two. My eyes widened in shock. You did what? We wanted to be closer to you both, Mr. Davis explained, looking earnest. Mrs. Davis looked hurt. We are family. Why wouldn't you want us here? I took a deep breath and said what I'd wanted to say for a long time. This house, it's mine. It's not owned jointly by Michael and me. It's in my name only. I retrieved a file from the study, showing them the ownership documents. Mrs. Davis looked at the papers and then back at me, clearly stunned. But you're married. What's yours is Michael's and vice versa, she exclaimed. I smiled triumphantly. That's where you're mistaken. We held a wedding ceremony, yes, but Michael and I never legally married. We never signed any official documents, so technically, you're not my in-laws. The weight of my words seemed to hang in the air. Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade paler, her eyes widening in disbelief. Mr. Davis looked from me to Michael, seeking some form of denial. Michael took my hand, signaling his support. It's true, Mom and Dad. We thought you'd be more accepting if we had a ceremony, but we never felt the need to get the state involved in our relationship. Mrs. Davis began to sob. So you deceived us, and now you're throwing us out? The room was heavy with tension after the bombshells were dropped. Michael's parents were clearly taken aback, but it wasn't long before the shock turned into outrage. So, you tricked everyone with a sham wedding, and you think that makes everything all right? Mrs. Davis's voice had a hint of venom. Michael sighed. It wasn't about tricking anyone. It was about the way we wanted to live our lives. The ceremony was for us and those who wanted to celebrate our love. Mrs. Davis's face turned a shade redder. You dare defy the sanctity of marriage, live together in sin, and then mock us with a fake wedding? I've had enough, Mr. Davis declared, standing up suddenly. You, young lady, are nothing but a sinner and a witch, trying to pull my son away from his family, his values. I was taken aback by the fierceness of their reaction, but I wouldn't let them intimidate me. I have not taken Michael from anyone. He's made his own choices, and it's high time you respect them. Mrs. Davis's eyes were filled with tears, but her voice was stern. Michael, come home with us. Leave this woman. She's done nothing but pull you into her web of deceit. Michael, ever the calm in the storm, replied, Mom, Dad, I love you both, but my place is here with her. She's been nothing but kind and understanding, even when you both haven't been. You can't just demand I leave her. You're choosing her over us. Mr. Davis's voice was a mix of anger and disbelief. I'm choosing to live my life on my terms, Dad. I'm choosing to be with Lizzie. The room went silent for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick, every breath heavy. Mrs. Davis's face was a mask of hurt and betrayal. Very well, she said, her voice cold. But remember this. You're turning your back on your family, on your faith, all for her. I'm not turning my back on anyone, Michael said firmly. I just wish you'd see that. Mrs. Davis's eyes were hard, her voice bitter. Let us go, she said to her husband, not giving either of us another glance. And with that they left, leaving behind a wake of hurt, confusion, and uncertainty. I looked at Michael, his face a mirror of my own feelings. We both knew that things had changed irrevocably, and there was no going back. A few days after the confrontation, as I was heading back from work, my neighbor, Mrs. Carlson, called out to me. She was an older lady known for her daily walks and her uncanny ability to know everyone's business. Did you hear about the Davis family not selling their house? She asked with a knowing look. I paused, taken aback. What do you mean? She leaned closer, lowering her voice. They never put their house on the market. I heard from Susan, who heard from Janice, who works at the town's real estate office. There's no record of the Davis property being up for sale. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Were they lying to us all this time? When I got home, I shared the information with Michael. He looked shocked. I can't believe they'd lie to us. What were they trying to achieve? We both knew the answer. They wanted to manipulate the situation to their advantage. The realization was a hard pill to swallow. All this time, while we tried to understand and accommodate them, they had been playing a game. Michael sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. This changes things. It's one thing to have disagreements, but outright deception, that's something else entirely. We can't keep letting them pull us into their manipulative games, I said firmly. We need boundaries, strong ones. Michael nodded. You're right. We can't continue like this. It's unhealthy for us and for our relationship. The next day he went over to his parents' house. He needed to confront them, get some answers. When he returned, his face was a mix of anger and sadness. They admitted it, he began, his voice heavy. They thought that if they moved in with us, we'd be a proper family again. They felt threatened by our independence. We sat down, discussing our next steps. It was clear that for our own sanity and the health of our relationship, we needed distance from them. We need a break, Michael declared. Some time away from all this drama and manipulation. I agreed. It's the best decision for us right now. That evening, we sent a message to his parents, informing them of our decision. The reply was filled with anger and accusations, but we remained firm. We needed this for ourselves and for our future. The next few weeks were quiet. We focused on each other, rebuilding the trust and closeness that had been strained over the past months. One evening, as we sat on our porch, looking at the stars, Michael turned to me. "Thank you," he whispered, "for standing by me, for fighting for us." I smiled, squeezing his hand. "Always." The journey had been long and fraught with challenges, but it was a poignant reminder of the importance of boundaries, honesty, and mutual respect in any relationship. As the night deepened, we looked toward the future, hoping for peace and understanding.
It was a gift from my husband that I received a wedding dress that cost $15,000. But on the day of our wedding, his mother, who was envious of me, surreptitiously lit it on fire. I was so taken aback that I collapsed to the ground. It was my husband, Aidan, who rushed to the scene and extinguished the fire, thereby saving my life. However, what transpired after that was something that she had not anticipated happening. I devised the supreme form of retribution. I am still able to recall the very first time that I came into contact with Aidan. Suddenly, it seemed as though time had slowed down, and everything else vanished. It was only him that I could see. In addition to being tall and charming, Aidan Gillen, a professional rugby player who was 30 years old, has a smile that could make any room brighter. The fact that he was attractive was not the only thing that drew me to him. It was the manner in which he dealt with me. Aidan was wonderful. He was kind with me, and he made me feel unique in a way that I had never experienced before. I was 29 years old at the time, and I was working in the city of Boston as an office assistant. My life was uncomplicated and unchanging. I had a lovely family, a wonderful job, and a group of close friends, but I always had the feeling that something was missing. It turned out that Aidan was the person in question. Our first encounter was at a gathering hosted by a friend. I was hanging out with a handful of coworkers at the time, while he was there with his friends from the national rugby team. This instant connection was something I felt from the time we started chatting to one another. There were a lot of things that we had in common, including our desire for experiencing new things and going on adventures, as well as our opinion that family is very important. As a potential mate, Aiden was all I had hoped for and more. In a short amount of time, our relationship flourished, and we were inseparable. Our conversation covered everything, including our plans for the future together. Before this, I had never been in a relationship in which I felt valued and loved to such an extent. When I was with Aiden, I had the impression that I was the most important person in the entire world. Soon after, we began discussing the possibility of getting married. It was like a dream that came true, and I couldn't wait for the day when we were going to get married. As a result of the fact that Aiden was everything I had ever desired, I believed that nothing could harm our happiness. On the other hand, every relationship has its difficulties, and ours arrived in the form of Miriam, an individual who is his mother. A few times prior, Aiden had brought her up in conversation. In spite of the fact that he spoke with courtesy, there was always a trace of stress in his voice whenever he discussed her. Until I met her, I didn't give it much thought. At least, that's how I felt. When I first encountered Miriam Gillen, I was able to meet her in person. She was a woman who was in her early 60s and presented herself in a forceful manner. In addition to having sharp features and nicely styled hair, she possessed a chilly personality that made me feel apprehensive. As soon as I laid eyes on her, I was struck by a peculiar shiver. Although she did not behave in an impolite manner, there was something about her that made her appear remote and perhaps judging. My irritation stemmed from the fact that she did not make me feel welcome. "I'm glad you could finally meet my mother, Taylor," Aiden said, trying to break the awkward silence during our lunch together. But Miriam barely looked at me when she replied, "Nice to meet you." Her tone was flat, and her eyes didn't stay on me for more than a few seconds. The air felt heavy with discomfort, but Aiden kept reassuring me, "Don't worry about her. She's just a little protective." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off with her. A few weeks after that tense meeting, Aiden surprised me with an incredible gift, a wedding dress. Not just any dress, though. It was worth $115,000, a luxurious gown that sparkled and shimmered with every movement. When he gave it to me, I felt overwhelmed with joy. It wasn't just the price that made me happy, it was the thought behind it. Aiden knew how much I dreamed of wearing the perfect dress on my wedding day, and he made that dream come true. The moment I saw the dress, I gasped in disbelief. "Oh my gosh, Aiden, this is amazing." My hands trembled as I ran them over the delicate fabric. "I can't believe you did this for me." He smiled warmly and said, "You deserve it, Taylor. I want everything about our wedding to be perfect for you." But I had no idea that this dress would become more than just a symbol of love. It would bring out something darker. When Miriam found out about the dress, the tension between us grew even stronger. I expected her to be happy for us, but instead, her face went cold as stone when she heard how much Aiden had spent on it. "That dress is too much, Aiden," she said tightly, her voice filled with restraint. "You don't need to spoil her with such extravagant things." "Spoil me?" Her words left me stunned. I never thought of the dress as being about spoiling me. For me, it was about feeling special and loved, but Miriam didn't see it that way. Aiden, however, stood firm. "I don't care, Mom. Taylor deserves this. She's my fiancée, and I love her. This is my choice, and I'm standing by it." The more Miriam disapproved, the colder things felt between us. I didn't want to cause any problems, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. I couldn't help but wonder, Why was she so upset about a dress meant to bring me joy? Then came the wedding day. I walked into the venue wearing my $115,000 dress, and all eyes were on me. Guests admired how beautiful I looked, and I felt proud with Aiden by my side. I was ready to start our new life together. As people came up to congratulate me, I happily shared the story behind the dress. Aiden gave me this beautiful dress, I said, smiling brightly. The compliments poured in, and I truly felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But then, just as everything felt perfect, Miriam approached me. Her expression was hard to read. She gave me a tight hug and whispered in my ear, "Your time is over now." I froze, unsure of what she meant, but there was no time to think. Suddenly, I felt warmth on my back. Before I could react, I realized my dress was on fire. Screams filled the room, and I spun around in panic. Miriam stood nearby, holding a cigarette lighter, her face calm but with a cold smile. My heart raced as I tried to process what was happening. I looked around desperately for Aiden. He was across the room with some friends, but when he saw the flames, his eyes widened in horror. He pushed through the crowd and ran toward me. The fire spread quickly, burning the outer layers of the dress. Aiden reached me just in time and worked to put out the flames using his jacket to smother them. The heat had seared to the fabric, leaving me with minor burns on my arms. My dress was ruined, but I was alive. "I'm fine, Aiden, really," I said, trying to reassure him, though inside I was shaken to my core. I was in shock. What had just happened? How could Miriam do something so awful? The rest of the wedding felt like a blur. I changed into a simple dress, but the sense of betrayal stayed with me. Something was very wrong, but I didn't fully understand it yet. That night, when Aiden and I got home, I overheard him talking to his mother. Miriam was furious, and her words sent chills through me. She wasn't upset about the dress catching fire. No, she was angry that Aiden had put the fire out. I didn't want to see that expensive dress on her. Miriam shouted, "Why did you even buy her something so extravagant?" In that moment, everything clicked. Miriam's jealousy wasn't just about the dress. She didn't want me to have the spotlight. She didn't want Aiden to love me more than her. I had been so blinded by love that I hadn't seen it sooner. Her coldness, her passive-aggressive comments. It all made sense now. That night, as I lay in bed, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't let her control our lives. Aiden loved me, but it felt like he was trapped in her grasp. I had to take control. That was when I decided to start my journey of taking back my power. Though I knew it wouldn't be easy, this was just the beginning. The days after the wedding were a blur. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The fire, the ruined dress, Miriam's cruel words. It was hard to believe that someone who was supposed to be family could do something so terrible. Aiden, on the other hand, seemed to shrug it all off like it was no big deal. He acted like nothing had happened, and honestly, I didn't know how to feel about that. The tension between us grew. We tried to act normal, but I couldn't ignore the emotional scars Miriam had left behind. The burns on my arms were nothing compared to the hurt inside. Aiden tried to be supportive, but it felt like I was carrying all the emotional weight in our relationship. About a week after the wedding, we were sitting on the couch together. I could tell something was bothering him. He kept glancing nervously between me and his phone. Finally, he spoke up. "Taylor, we need to talk about something." My heart skipped a beat. I already had a feeling about what it was. "Is this about Miriam?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked down at his hands, avoiding my eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about my mom and how she's been acting," he said quietly. "I know she's upset about the dress, and I just want you to understand she's not used to sharing me with anyone. It's hard for her." A knot tightened in my stomach. Was he seriously defending her behavior? Could he not see how toxic his mother was? I stared at him, feeling a wave of frustration. "Aiden, it's not just about the dress," I said, my voice trembling. "It's about everything, the way she treats me, the way she makes me feel worthless. That's not normal." He finally looked at me, his expression soft. I know, and I'm sorry. I really am, but she's my mom. I can't just cut her off like that." "Why not?" I asked, my frustration spilling over. "She's been controlling you your entire life, and now she's trying to control our relationship. Why are you so afraid of her?" Aiden flinched at my words. "I'm not scared, Taylor. She's been there for me my whole life. She's my family." Tears welled up in my eyes. "And what about me? Am I supposed to just accept her mistreatment because she's your family? Am I supposed to let her treat me like I don't matter?" He fell silent, his face conflicted. I knew he was trying to make sense of it all, but it wasn't enough. The more I thought about it, the more I felt like I was losing him to a woman who wouldn't even respect me as his partner. The next day, I overheard another conversation. This time, I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. It just happened. I was walking through the house when I heard Aiden and his mother talking in the living room. I froze when I heard Miriam's sharp, angry voice. "You really let her get to you, didn't you? Miriam's bad. You let her ruin everything. The dress, the wedding. She doesn't belong in our family. She's just a distraction." Her words hit me like a slap to the face. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Miriam's jealousy ran so deep that she couldn't stand the sight of me with her son. And Aiden, he didn't say a word. He didn't defend me. He didn't stand up for me. "Mom, please," Aiden finally said, his voice strained. "Stop. I'm trying to make this work. I love Taylor, and I love you." Miriam's tone turned icy. "I've always been your priority, Aiden. And if you really think she's the one for you, then why did you give her such an expensive dress? Why would you spoil her like that?" I felt my heart sink. It was clear to me now, this wasn't just about a dress or a wedding. Miriam didn't want me in her family, and Aiden didn't know how to choose between us. A surge of anger rushed through me, and I couldn't hold it back. I walked into the living room, my face flushed with emotion. "Why do you care so much about a dress?" I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. "Why does it bother you that Aiden loves me? Why are you trying to ruin everything between us?" Miriam turned to me, her expression cold and full of disdain. "Because you are a distraction, Taylor. A beautiful, expensive distraction. But you'll never truly be part of this family." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. How could she say that? How could she treat me like I didn't matter? "Aiden, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." But Aiden just looked at me, torn and helpless. "Taylor, please." "I'm trying. You don't understand. This is hard for me." I shook my head, feeling the weight of his words. "It's hard for you." I thought bitterly, what about me? I couldn't listen anymore. I needed to get away, from him, from Miriam, from all of it. That night, I went to my parents' house, feeling like my whole world was falling apart. I sat in my old bedroom, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. It wasn't just about Miriam anymore. It was about Aiden, too. I was starting to see the truth. I couldn't be happy with someone who wouldn't stand up for me. I felt like a stranger in my own relationship. That's when I made my decision. I couldn't live this way anymore. I needed to get away from Miriam, from Aiden, and from all the manipulation and control. I decided I needed a divorce, but it wasn't just about leaving. I couldn't walk away without confronting the truth about what Miriam had done. I couldn't let her get away with it. I needed to fight back. It wasn't an easy choice. Deciding to divorce Aiden felt like a heavy weight had been lifted, but it also terrified me. I loved him truly, loved him, but I couldn't ignore the reality anymore. Miriam wasn't just controlling, she was toxic. She had no respect for me, and no matter how much Aiden claimed to love me, he would always choose her over me. The way he couldn't stand up to her, the way he let her destroy our relationship, it was something I couldn't ignore anymore. I deserved better, and now I was ready to fight for myself. I spent the next few days at my parents' house, trying to process everything. I felt like I was walking through a thick fog, unable to see clearly. I couldn't stop thinking about the wedding, the fire, and Miriam's cold, calculated words. Her voice echoed in my mind, and every time I replayed the scene, my heart sank all over again. One night, as I lay in bed, an idea came to me. I needed proof, something Aiden couldn't deny, something that would force him to see who his mother really was. The next morning, I grabbed my phone and started going through the footage from the wedding. I had recorded everything, thinking it would be a beautiful memory to look back on. But now, I wasn't sure if I'd ever want to revisit those moments again. As I skimmed through the video, my stomach turned. Then I saw it. In the moment Miriam hugged me, whispering those chilling words in my ear, her hand moved toward her pocket. She pulled out a cigarette lighter. My breath caught in my throat. I had noticed it during the chaos, but there it was, clear as day. Miriam had deliberately set my dress on fire. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, unable to believe it. How could she do this? Why would she do this? But as I thought about it, the truth became clearer. This wasn't just jealousy. Miriam was terrified of losing her control over Aiden. She was willing to do anything, even ruin our lives, to keep her grip on him. With the video as proof, I knew I had to act. I couldn't let her get away with this. I called the police. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but I didn't have another choice. She had risked my safety, destroyed the most important day of my life, and manipulated Aiden for far too long. It had to stop. The police took my report seriously, and an investigation was launched. It didn't take long for them to gather enough evidence to arrest Miriam. When I got the call telling me she had been taken into custody, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief because she was finally being held accountable, and anger because she had taken so much from me. This wasn't just about the dress or the fire. It was about everything she had done to try to break me. But now, I was finally taking back control of my life. I knew Miriam was finally going to face the consequences for everything she had done to me and Aiden. But I couldn't help feeling angry too. Angry about the pain she caused, and the way Aiden let her actions go unchecked. When Aiden found out about her arrest, he was furious. He called me, shouting and accusing me of ruining his family. But I didn't care anymore. I had tried to be patient, tried to make things work. But I had given him every chance to stand up for me, and he hadn't. In my eyes, he was just as responsible as Miriam. "I can't believe you do this to me," Aiden yelled, his voice trembling with rage. "She's my mother, Taylor. She's the only family I have left." "Well, I was your family too," I said, my voice steady but firm. "But I wasn't enough for you, was I? You chose her over me, and you always will." There was silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his heavy breathing, filled with frustration and disbelief. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied calmly. "I'm done, Aiden. I can't live like this anymore." And with that, I hung up. I knew it was over. My marriage was over, but instead of feeling broken, I felt free. Free from Miriam, free from Aiden, and free from all the manipulation and control that had held me down for so long. The police eventually charged Miriam with multiple offenses, including endangering my safety. She was sentenced to a long prison term. When I heard the news, I felt a strange sense of justice. I had taken a stand, fought back, and won. But the real victory wasn't her punishment. It was reclaiming my life. I promised myself that I would never let anyone, not even family, control my happiness again. After everything that had happened, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The chaos, the heartbreak, the fire, it was all behind me. For the first time in months, a sense of peace settled over me. But I knew that the hardest part was still ahead. Moving on. Rebuilding my life started slowly. I spent the first few weeks focusing on myself, something I hadn't done in years. My life had always revolved around others, Aiden, his family, and trying to keep everyone happy. But now it was about me. I began reconnecting with old friends I hadn't seen in ages. I spent more time with my own family, the people who truly loved and supported me. For the first time in a long while, I found joy in simply being alone. Piece by piece, I started to rebuild, and with each step, I felt a little stronger. I truly felt strong when I looked at who I had become. I had been through so much, yet here I was, standing tall. I had fought for myself and won. It was a power I had never felt before. I thought my story was over, but then something unexpected happened. A few months had passed since Miriam's arrest. Aiden and I hadn't spoken since that last phone call. I thought he might be angry or try to contact me, but he didn't. Then one afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was Aiden. I hesitated before answering, unsure if I was ready for this conversation. "Taylor," he said softly, his voice sounding tired. "I've been thinking about everything, and I know you probably won't forgive me, but I need to apologize. I didn't see it back then, but I see it now. I was blind to what my mom was doing. I should have stood up for you. I'm sorry." I didn't know how to respond. My heart felt torn. Part of me wanted to yell at him for everything he had put me through, but another part of me just wanted closure. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Aiden," I said, my voice steady but full of emotion. "You had so many chances, and you chose your mom over me every single time. I'm not going to let that happen again. I've moved on." There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing on the other end, like he was trying to find the right words. "I understand," he said quietly. "I just want you to know that I've changed. I see now how wrong I was. I'm sorry for everything." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his apology, but deep down I knew it wasn't enough. He had failed me when I needed him most, and now I was stronger because of it. In a firm tone, I said, "Goodbye, Aiden," and my tone was calm and confident. "Take care of yourself." It was over in an instant, just like that. This was the last chapter of that period of my life, and it was now over. I had liberated myself from the man with whom I had once imagined spending the rest of my life, from the family that had never welcomed me, and from a life that had been preventing me from fully realizing my potential. Although life was not without its flaws, the fact that it was mine was sufficient. Once more, I was not going to give someone the power to govern my life. No one, not even Miriam. Anyone. The strength of a woman who was willing to fight for herself was something that she never understood, despite the fact that she was quite manipulative. As time went on, I resolved to concentrate on my own contentment. Investing my time and energy into my job, discovering inner peace, and engaging in activities that brought me genuine happiness were the things I focused on. After gaining this knowledge, I realized how vital it was to advocate for myself and to never let the envy or control of another person to constitute my identity. A little over a year later, I received information that completely altered my life. I was carrying a child. It came as a surprise, but it brought me a level of happiness that I had never experienced before. The plan was for me to become a mother. I had made up my mind that I would bring up my child in an environment where love, respect, and happiness were prioritized above all else. That day, when I told my parents, is still fresh in my mind. Upon hearing the news, my mother's face lit up with delight, and I could see the pride that she appeared to be feeling in her eyes. She was aware of everything that I had been challenged with and how far I had progressed. I had reclaimed my life, and I was at last constructing a future that would be governed by my own specifications. As I sat with my family and the man who had become my true partner, someone who loved me for who I was and respected me for who I was, I realized that I had made the correct decisions. The events of my past will forever be a part of my narrative, but they no longer serve to define who I am. I had no restrictions. I had prevailed in my struggle, and now I was enjoying the life that I had always envisioned for myself.
My name is Avery Collins, and I never expected to find myself in a war with my dead husband's brother. But here I am, staring down the barrel of a family feud that threatens to tear apart everything I've worked so hard to preserve. The doorbell rang, shattering the peaceful quiet of my Saturday afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But something, call it instinct or just plain curiosity, made me set down my book and make my way to the front door. I wish I hadn't. There he stood, Griffin Collins, my late husband Ethan's younger brother. His smile was as charming as ever, but there was a glint in his eye that made my skin crawl. "Avery, darling, it's been far too long," he exclaimed, stepping forward as if to embrace me. I took a step back, my hand still on the doorknob. "Griffin, what are you doing here?" He feigned hurt, placing a hand over his heart. Can a man visit his beloved sister-in-law, especially after such a tragedy? I bit back a retort. Ethan had been gone for 6 months, and this was the first I'd heard from Griffin. "Of course," I said instead, forcing a smile. "Please come in." As I led him to the living room, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was inviting a fox into the henhouse. Ethan's words echoed in my mind. "Be careful of Griffin, Avery. He's got a heart of gold, but it's fool's gold." Griffin settled into Ethan's favorite armchair, and I had to resist the urge to tell him to move. Instead, I perched on the edge of the sofa, my back straight as a board. "So, Griffin, what brings you by after all this time?" He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Well, Avery, I've been doing some thinking. About family, about legacy, about what's fair." My stomach dropped. Here it comes, I thought. "I think it's time we discussed Ethan's estate," Griffin continued, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe there are some discrepancies that need to be addressed." I blinked, momentarily stunned. Discrepancies? "Griffin, everything was settled months ago. The will was clear." "Was it?" He interrupted, his charm slipping for a moment to reveal something harder underneath. "I find it hard to believe that my dear brother would leave everything to you, Avery. We were blood after all." I stood up, anger rising in my chest. "Ethan and I were married for 30 years, Griffin. We built a life together. A life you were rarely part of, I might add." Griffin rose as well, his height allowing him to tower over me. Now, Avery, let's not get emotional. I'm simply suggesting we take another look at things. For the sake of family." "The answer is no, Griffin," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "There's nothing to discuss. I think you should leave." For a moment I thought he might argue, but then that charming smile slid back into place. Of course, of course. I can see you need time to think this over. But mark my words, Avery, this isn't over. As I showed him to the door, he turned back, his eyes cold despite his smile. You'll regret this, Avery. One way or another, I'll get what's rightfully mine. The door closed behind him with a final sounding click, and I leaned against it, my heart pounding. I knew, deep in my bones, that this was just the beginning. Griffin wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, or until I stopped him. As I made my way back to the living room, my eyes fell on a photo of Ethan and me on our last anniversary. Oh, Ethan, I whispered. What am I going to do? Little did I know, the answer to that question would lead me down a path I never could have imagined, a path of secrets, lies, and a battle for the very legacy Ethan left behind. The attic was stuffy, dust motes dancing in the thin beams of sunlight that snuck through the small window. I sneezed as I pulled another box from the stack, the label faded but still legible. Ethan's Papers, 2010 to 2015. My encounter with Griffin had left me shaken, but it also ignited a fire in me. If he thought there was more to Ethan's estate, maybe there was. And I was determined to find it before he did. I'd been at it for hours, sifting through old tax returns, bank statements, and what seemed like endless junk mail. Just as I was about to call it quits, a thick manila envelope caught my eye. It was unmarked, tucked between two folders. With trembling fingers, I opened it. Inside were documents I'd never seen before, investment reports, offshore account statements, and a handwritten letter from Ethan. My dearest Avery, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've found what I've kept hidden for so long. I'm sorry for the secrecy, but I needed to protect us, from Griffin, from the vultures of the world. This fortune is for you, to use as you see fit. But be careful. Griffin has always suspected, and he'll stop at nothing to get his hands on it. I sat back, stunned. The document showed a fortune far beyond anything I'd imagined. Ethan had built an empire in secret, and now it was mine to protect. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Found any buried treasure yet? Avery? Better share the wealth before things get ugly. My blood ran cold. How could Griffin know? I scrambled to gather the papers, my mind racing. I needed to secure these documents, to protect this legacy Ethan had left me. Just then, the doorbell rang, startling me so badly I dropped the envelope, papers scattering across the attic floor. Heart pounding, I made my way downstairs. Through the peephole, I saw Mrs. Hendricks, my elderly neighbor, looking distressed. I opened the door cautiously. Avery, dear, she said, wringing her hands. I hate to bother you, but I've just had the most unsettling conversation with your brother-in-law in the supermarket. My stomach dropped. Griffin? What did he say? Mrs. Hendricks looked uncomfortable. Well, he was asking all sorts of questions about you and Ethan, insinuating things. It wasn't right, the way he was talking. I thought you should know. I thanked her, my mind whirling. Griffin was making moves, trying to turn the community against me. I needed to act fast. Back inside, I returned to the attic, gathering the scattered papers with new urgency. As I did, a small business card fell from one of the folders. It read, Jonah Reeves, attorney at law. Jonah, my old friend. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was him. I reached for my phone, then hesitated. What if Griffin had somehow tapped my line? Paranoia was setting in, but I couldn't take any chances. I'd have to see Jonah in person. As I made my way back downstairs, clutching the envelope of secrets to my chest, another text came through. Tick-tock, Avery. Time's running out. I squared my shoulders, a plan forming in my mind. Griffin thought he could intimidate me, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. I was Avery Collins, and I would fight with everything I had to protect what was mine. Tomorrow, I'd see Jonah. We'd figure out how to secure these assets, how to stay one step ahead of Griffin. But tonight, I had work to do. I needed to go through every scrap of paper, every account statement, and make sure I understood exactly what I was dealing with. As I settled in for a long night of research, I couldn't help but smile grimly. Griffin wanted a war? Well, he was about to get one. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped into Jonah's law office. The familiar scent of old books and coffee greeted me, a comforting contrast to the anxiety churning in my stomach. Jonah looked up from his desk, his eyes widening in surprise. "Avery, what brings you here?" I closed the door behind me, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "I need your help, Jonah. It's about Ethan's estate. And Griffin." Jonah's expression darkened. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down. Tell me everything." For the next hour, I poured out the whole story. Griffin's visit, the hidden fortune, the threatening messages. Jonah listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each revelation. "This is serious, Avery," he said when I finished. "We need to act fast to secure those assets. And as for Griffin," he trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "I think it's time we did some digging of our own." Over the next few days, Jonah and I worked tirelessly. We set up new accounts, transferred funds, and created a paper trail that would be nearly impossible for Griffin to trace. But it was what Jonah uncovered about Griffin that truly shocked me. "Look at this," Jonah said, spreading out a series of documents on his desk. "Griffin's been involved in at least 3 fraudulent business ventures in the last decade. He's left a trail of angry investors and lawsuits behind him." I leaned in, scanning the papers. "But how has he gotten away with it?" Jonah's expression was grim. Charm, mostly, and a knack for disappearing just before things fall apart. But his luck's running out. His last venture collapsed spectacularly, and he's drowning in debt. That's why he's after Ethan's money. It's his last hope. The pieces were falling into place. "So, what do? "We gather evidence," Jonah replied, his eyes glinting with determination. "Every shady deal, every angry investor. We build a case so strong that Griffin won't know what hit him." As we worked, Griffin's harassment intensified. Ominous notes appeared in my mailbox. I'd catch glimpses of him watching me in town. But each threat only strengthened my resolve. One evening, as I was leaving Jonah's office, I ran into Sarah, an old friend from my book club. Her eyes widened when she saw me, and she quickly looked away. "Sarah?" I called out. "Is everything okay?" She hesitated, then turned back. "Oh, Avery, I don't know what to believe anymore. Griffin's been saying such terrible things about you. About how you manipulated Ethan, how you're hiding money that should go to charity." My heart sank. So this was Griffin's game. Turn the community against me. I took a deep breath. "Sarah, none of that is true. Griffin is trying to steal Ethan's legacy. I can prove it." Sarah looked uncertain, but she nodded. "I want to believe you, Avery. You've always been a good friend." As she walked away, I felt a mix of anger and determination. Griffin was playing dirty, but I wouldn't stoop to his level. I'd fight with the truth. Back in Jonah's office, I shared what had happened. He nodded grimly. "It's a classic tactic. Isolate the target, make them vulnerable. But we're not going to let that happen." He pulled out a fresh legal pad. "Let's make a list of everyone in town who might be willing to vouch for your character. We'll need allies in this fight." As we worked late into the night, I felt a glimmer of hope. Griffin thought he had me cornered, but he'd underestimated me. With Jonah by my side and the truth as our weapon, we were building a case that would not only protect Ethan's legacy, but expose Griffin for the fraud he truly was. The battle lines were drawn. Now it was time to fight back. The whispers followed me everywhere. At the grocery store, the post office, even during my morning walks. Sidelong glances, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached. Griffin's smear campaign was in full swing, and I could feel the community's trust in me eroding with each passing day. "Did you hear? Avery's been embezzling from Ethan's charity fund for years." I always thought she seemed too good to be true. Poor Ethan must be rolling in his grave. The lies stung, each one a dagger to my heart. But I refused to let them break me. Instead, I channeled my pain into determination, working tirelessly with Jonah to build our case against Griffin. One afternoon, as I was leaving the library, I bumped into Tom, the owner of the local hardware store and a longtime friend of Ethan's. "Avery," he said, his voice cold. I think it's best if you don't come by the store anymore. We don't serve thieves here. I felt like I'd been slapped. Tom, you've known me for 30 years. You can't possibly believe. Save it. He cut me off. Griffin showed me the proof. Bank statements, withdrawal slips, all in your handwriting. How could you do this to Ethan's memory? As Tom walked away, leaving me stunned on the sidewalk, I realized the depths of Griffin's desperation. He was fabricating evidence now, and doing it well enough to fool even those who knew me best. I rushed to Jonah's office, my hands shaking as I recounted what had happened. This is getting out of hand, Jonah said, his face grim. We need to move faster. I've been in touch with some of Griffin's former business partners. They're willing to testify about his fraudulent practices, but they're scared. We need to assure them they'll be protected. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. TikTok, Avery. The vultures are circling, ready to negotiate yet. I showed Jonah the message, my jaw clenched. He thinks he's winning. Jonah's eyes narrowed. Let him think that. It'll make our counterattack all the more effective. Over the next few days, we worked around the clock. Jonah coordinated with Griffin's victims, building a network of witnesses willing to speak out. I focused on gathering character references from old friends and colleagues, people who knew the real me and could vouch for my integrity. But Griffin wasn't idle. His attacks escalated. Graffiti appeared on my garage door one morning. Thief, in angry red letters. Anonymous calls flooded my phone, filled with threats and accusations. The final straw came during the town's annual charity auction. I'd always been a key organizer, but this year, I'd been pointedly uninvited. Curious to see Griffin's next move, I attended anyway, keeping to the shadows at the back of the room. Griffin took the stage, his charm on full display. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice dripping with false sincerity, I have a sad announcement to make. It's come to light that a significant amount of money from last year's auction has gone missing. And I'm afraid all evidence points to one person, Avery Collins. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. I felt the weight of accusing stares, saw the disappointment and anger on faces I'd known for years. In that moment, something inside me snapped. The fear and hurt I'd been carrying transformed into a steely resolve. I stepped out of the shadows, my head held high. That's a lie, Griffin, I said, my voice ringing clear across the suddenly silent room. And I can prove it. All eyes turned to me. Griffin's smug expression faltered for a moment before he recovered, plastering on a sympathetic smile. Avery, dear, this isn't the time or place. Oh, I think it's exactly the right time and place, I interrupted, walking towards the stage. You want to talk about missing money? Let's talk about your fraudulent business ventures. Let's talk about the trail of deceived investors you've left in your wake. The room was dead silent now, all attention riveted on the unfolding drama. As I climbed the steps to the stage, I locked eyes with Griffin. His mask of charm had slipped, revealing the desperation beneath. The battle lines were drawn. It was time to expose the truth, once and for all. The tension in Jonah's office was palpable as we pored over the documents spread across his desk. My hands trembled as I picked up a yellowed piece of paper, its edges frayed with age. This can't be real, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jonah leaned in, his brow furrowed. What is it, Avery? I held up the document, a last will and testament dated just weeks before Ethan's death. It's a new will, one that leaves everything to Griffin. But Ethan would never. He didn't, Jonah interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he examined the paper. This is a forgery, and not a very good one at that. Where did you find this? It was mixed in with the papers from Ethan's study. I must have overlooked it before. A chill ran down my spine as the implications sank in. Griffin must have planted it there during one of his visits. Jonah's expression hardened. This is serious, Avery. He's not just spreading rumors anymore. He's committing fraud. As the gravity of the situation settled over us, my phone buzzed with a text. It was from Griffin. Found my surprise yet? Time's running out. Dear sister-in-law, meet me at the old boathouse tomorrow at noon. Come alone, or everyone sees the will. I showed Jonah the message, my heart racing. He's making his move. Jonah stood up, pacing the room. This is our chance, Avery. We can catch him red-handed. Over the next few hours, we formulated a plan. Jonah would contact the police and set up surveillance at the boathouse. I would meet Griffin as requested, wearing a hidden microphone to record our conversation. As dawn broke, I found myself standing at the edge of the lake, the old boathouse looming before me. The weight of the microphone beneath my blouse felt like a lifeline. Griffin emerged from the shadows, his usual charm replaced by a barely concealed desperation. Avery, so glad you could make it. I trust you've had time to consider my offer? I steeled myself, channeling all the anger and hurt of the past weeks into my voice. You mean your blackmail attempt? Griffin, this has to stop. That will is a forgery, and we both know it. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Prove it. By the time anyone figures it out, I'll be long gone with my share of Ethan's fortune. Face it, Avery. You've lost. Have I? I countered, reaching into my bag. I pulled out a stack of documents, the real evidence we'd gathered against him. Fraudulent business deals, angry investors, a trail of deceit stretching back years. Is this really how you want to honor Ethan's memory? For a moment, Griffin's mask slipped, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. But then his eyes hardened. You're bluffing. You've got nothing. Am I? I pressed. The police are on their way, Griffin. This is your last chance to come clean, to make things right. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. Griffin's face paled, his bravado crumbling. You set me up, he snarled, lunging for the documents in my hand. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on a loose board. As I fell, I saw a blur of movement, Jonah, emerging from his hiding place, tackling Griffin to the ground. The next few minutes were a chaos of shouting and flashing lights as the police arrived. As they led Griffin away in handcuffs, I caught his eye. For a moment, I saw not the conniving fraud, but the little brother Ethan had always tried to protect. It didn't have to be this way, I said softly. Griffin's shoulders slumped in defeat. I know, he whispered. I'm sorry, Avery. For everything. As the police car drove away, Jonah helped me to my feet. It's over, he said, squeezing my hand. But as I looked out over the lake, where Ethan and I had spent so many happy summers, I knew it wasn't over. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. One where I would honor Ethan's legacy the way he had always intended. The conference room at the Oak Ridge Country Club buzzed with anticipation. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, my heart pounding beneath my carefully composed exterior. Jonah stood by the door, nodding reassuringly as a group of well-dressed men and women filed in, taking their seats around the table. These weren't real investors, of course. They were Jonah's associates, carefully briefed and ready to play their parts in our elaborate trap. As I scanned their faces, I caught sight of a familiar figure striding confidently into the room. Griffin had arrived. He paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. I could almost see the wheels turning in his head, calculating his next move. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, his trademark charm emerged full force. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, flashing his $1,000,000 smile, I can't tell you how excited I am to present this incredible opportunity. I watched in silent amazement as Griffin launched into his pitch. He spoke of revolutionary green energy technology, of projected profits that would make everyone in the room millionaires within a year. His charisma was undeniable, his words weaving a tapestry of dreams and possibilities. But I knew the truth that lay beneath the glittering facade. As Griffin reached the crescendo of his presentation, he pulled out a stack of documents with a flourish. And here, he declared triumphantly, are the patents and financial projections that prove everything I've been saying. This was the moment we'd been waiting for. I caught Jonah's eye, and he gave an almost imperceptible nod. May I see those, Griffin? I asked, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. His smile faltered for just a moment before he recovered. Of course, dear sister-in-law. I'm surprised to see you here, but I'm sure you'll be as impressed as everyone else. As I took the documents, I could feel the weight of every eye in the room upon me. Slowly, deliberately, I began to leaf through the pages. "These are very impressive, Griffin," I said, my tone neutral. "But I have to ask, are they real?" The room fell silent. Griffin's charm evaporated, replaced by a look of barely concealed panic. "What are you implying, Avery?" I stood up, my resolve strengthening with each passing second. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. These documents are forgeries, just like the will you planted in Ethan's study." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. Griffin's face contorted with rage. "You have no proof." "Oh, but I do," I interrupted, nodding to Jonah. He stepped forward, distributing folders to everyone at the table. "In these folders, you'll find evidence of Griffin's fraudulent activities spanning the last decade. Fake companies, embezzled funds, and a trail of deceived investors left in his wake." As the assembled group pored over the damning evidence, Griffin's composure crumbled entirely. "You set me up," he snarled, lunging towards me. But Jonah was faster. He intercepted Griffin, restraining him as two uniformed police officers entered the room. "Griffin Collins," one of the officers announced, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and attempted extortion." As they led Griffin away in handcuffs, his eyes locked with mine. The anger had faded, replaced by something I never thought I'd see in my brother-in-law's gaze: defeat. "Why, Avery," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "why go to all this trouble?" I stepped closer, my voice low but firm. "Because it's what Ethan would have wanted. He always believed there was good in you, Griffin. Maybe it's time you started believing it too." As the door closed behind Griffin and the officers, a heavy silence fell over the room. I turned to face the assembled group, my chin held high. "I want to thank you all for your part in this," I said. "What you've witnessed today is the end of a long and painful chapter. But it's also the beginning of something new, a chance to honor Ethan's memory by using his legacy for good." As I outlined my plans for a charitable foundation in Ethan's name, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The storm had passed, and though the road ahead might be challenging, I was ready to face it, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make Ethan proud. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and curious onlookers as I made my way inside. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Today was the day Griffin would face the consequences of his actions. As I entered the courtroom, I caught sight of him sitting at the defendant's table. Gone was the confident charm, replaced by a haggard, defeated look. Our eyes met briefly, and I saw a flicker of something, regret, perhaps, before he quickly looked away. Jonah squeezed my arm reassuringly as we took our seats. "Are you ready for this?" he whispered. I nodded, steeling myself for what was to come. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. What followed was a damning litany of Griffin's crimes. The prosecutor methodically laid out each fraudulent scheme, each betrayed investor, each forged document. With each new revelation, I could see Griffin shrinking further into himself. When it came time for victim impact statements, I was surprised to see familiar faces from our community step forward. Tom from the hardware store, Sarah from my book club, even Mrs. Hendricks. All had fallen prey to Griffin's charm and deceit at some point. Their stories were heartbreaking. Life savings lost, dreams shattered, trust betrayed. As I listened, I felt a mix of anger and pity for Griffin. How had he strayed so far from the brother Ethan had always believed in? Finally, it was my turn to speak. As I approached the stand, I caught Griffin's eye. The mask of indifference he'd worn throughout the trial cracked, revealing a vulnerability I'd never seen before. I took a deep breath and began. Your Honor, I'm not here today to condemn Griffin Collins. I'm here to speak for someone who can't be here, my late husband, Ethan. Ethan always believed in the goodness of his brother, even when evidence suggested otherwise. He believed in second chances and the power of redemption. I paused, gathering my thoughts. What Griffin has done is inexcusable. He's hurt people, destroyed lives, and betrayed the trust of those who cared for him. But I believe that somewhere beneath all that greed and deception is the brother Ethan loved. The man who has the potential to make amends and become something better. Turning to face Griffin directly, I continued, "That's why I'm offering you a choice, Griffin. I'm willing to drop the charges against you, on two conditions. First, you must make a public apology and commit to paying back every person you've defrauded, to the best of your ability. Second, you agree to seek professional help to address the root of your unethical behavior." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Griffin's eyes widened in disbelief. The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Mrs. Collins, are you certain about this?" I nodded firmly. "I am, Your Honor. I believe this path offers the best chance for true justice and rehabilitation." All eyes turned to Griffin. For a long moment, he sat frozen, conflict evident on his face. Then slowly he stood. I accept," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder, "I accept Avery's offer. And
I'm sorry.
to everyone I've hurt, to Avery, to
Ethan.
I'm so sorry." As Griffin began to detail his crimes and offer his apology to the court and his victims, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. This wasn't the end, not by a long shot. There would be a long road of restitution and rehabilitation ahead.
But it was a start.
Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. I stood before the microphones, Jonah by my side, and addressed the crowd. Today marks the end of a painful chapter, but also the beginning of a new one. The Ethan Collins Foundation will work to support those affected by financial fraud and to promote ethical business practices. We believe in second chances and the power of community to heal and grow stronger together. As the cameras flashed and questions flew, I caught sight of Griffin being led away by his lawyer. Our eyes met one last time, and I saw a glimmer of something I hadn't seen in years: hope. The battle was over, but the real work of healing and rebuilding was just beginning. And for the first time in months, I felt truly ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The grand opening of the Ethan Collins Community Center was a day I'd dreamed of for months. Yet nothing could have prepared me for the overwhelming emotions as I stood before the gathered crowd. The autumn sun warmed my face as I looked out at the sea of familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and even a few former skeptics who had come around in the wake of Griffin's exposure. "Today," I began, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat, "we're not just opening a building. We're opening a new chapter for our community, one built on the foundation of trust, compassion, and second chances that Ethan always believed in." As I spoke about the center's programs, financial literacy classes, support groups for fraud victims, mentorship opportunities for at-risk youth, I could almost feel Ethan's presence beside me, his quiet pride radiating through the crisp fall air. After the ribbon cutting, I mingled with the crowd, accepting congratulations and heartfelt apologies in equal measure. Tom from the hardware store approached, his eyes downcast. "Avery, I can't tell you how sorry I am for doubting you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I squeezed his arm gently. "What matters is that we're here now, Tom. Together." As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn to a quiet corner of the center's garden. A simple bench sat beneath an old oak tree, Ethan's favorite spot for contemplation. I sank onto it, feeling the weight of the past year settling on my shoulders. "I did it, Ethan," I whispered to the wind. "I protected your legacy, just like I promised. And you did a damn fine job of it, too." I startled at the familiar voice, turning to find Jonah approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. He handed me one as he sat beside me. "Thank you, Jonah, for everything," I said, the words feeling inadequate for the depth of my gratitude. He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "You did all the heavy lifting, Avery. I just provided the legal muscle." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, sipping our coffee and watching the last of the day's visitors trickle out of the center. "Have you heard from Griffin?" Jonah asked softly. I nodded. "He's sticking to the program. Weekly therapy sessions, volunteering at the center's financial literacy classes. It's not easy for him, but he's trying." Jonah's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And how do you feel about that?" I considered the question carefully. "Hopeful," I finally said. "Cautiously hopeful. Ethan always believed there was good in Griffin.
Maybe?
Maybe he was right all along. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The journey had been long and painful, filled with betrayal and heartache. But it had also shown me the strength I possessed, the unwavering support of true friends, and the power of a community united. Standing up, I took one last look at the center, at Ethan's legacy made tangible. "Come on," I said to Jonah, a smile tugging at my lips. "We've got work to do." As we walked back towards the building, I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement for what lay ahead. The battle to protect Ethan's estate was over, but the real work, the work of healing, growing, and building a better future, was just beginning. And for the first time since Ethan's passing, I felt truly ready to embrace that future. Not just as Ethan's widow, but as Avery Collins, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to make a difference. The center's lights flickered on as dusk fell, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. And as I stepped through its doors, ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead, I knew that Ethan would be proud. Not just of what I'd accomplished, but of who I'd become in the process. This wasn't an ending, I realized. It was a beginning, a new chapter in a story that was far from over. And I couldn't wait to see where it would lead.